For Japanese commanders during World War II, one of the greatest shocks was not merely the overwhelming size of America's fleets or the endless numbers of tanks and aircraft, but something far more ordinary: the sight of American soldiers eating fresh bread on the front lines. It was a detail that seemed trivial at first glance, yet to seasoned officers who understood the brutal mechanics of supply, it carried staggering implications. Bread was fragile. It went stale quickly, required flour and ovens, demanded transport and storage. In the Japanese army, soldiers survived on rice balls, millet, or preserved rations that could withstand weeks without spoiling. Fresh bread was a luxury, reserved for officers in rear positions, and even then in limited supply. To see ordinary American soldiers tearing into loaves, buttering slices, or enjoying sandwiches at the very edges of battle lines was not just surprising. It was terrifying. The Japanese military prided itself on endurance through deprivation. Soldiers were taught to survive on meager rations, to see hunger as a test of spirit. They carried rice in canvas bags, sometimes mixed with barley or millet, and supplemented it with pickled vegetables or dried fish if available. By contrast, American troops expected and received meals that would not only sustain, but satisfy them. Fresh bread was part of a larger system of abundance: field bakeries, mobile ovens, logistical chains, so vast and reliable that even perishable food could reach combat zones daily. To Japanese commanders, this was more than food. It was proof of industrial supremacy, of a logistical machine beyond anything they could imagine. Reports from captured supplies astonished them. Field bakeries mounted on trucks churned out thousands of loaves a day, feeding battalions as though they were still back home. Portable ovens followed armies across Europe and the Pacific, establishing bakeries within days of capturing new ground. Soldiers could expect fresh bread alongside canned meat, vegetables, coffee, and even desserts. These comforts seemed impossible to Japanese officers who struggled to keep their own men alive on dwindling rice supply. The bread became a symbol where Japan asked sacrifice. America offered comfort. The psychological effect of this abundance cannot be overstated. Japanese officers understood that morale was as important as bullets. A hungry soldier might fight bravely for a time, but his strength waned. A well-fed soldier not only fought harder, but believed in the system that sustained him. Fresh bread on the front lines was not a small indulgence. It was a daily reminder to American troops that their nation valued them, that they were supported, and that their lives mattered. Japanese soldiers, in contrast, often felt expendable, urged to endure hunger as proof of loyalty. Captured Japanese officers later admitted that the bread was one of the most shocking discoveries of the war. They had expected America to have tanks, planes, and ships. Those were visible and measurable. But to see supply chains so efficient that fresh food traveled across oceans and through jungles to reach men in foxholes was something else entirely. It meant that America's strength was not only in production, but in distribution. It meant that no matter where the war was fought, America could bring a piece of home to its soldiers. That truth was as demoralizing as any defeat in battle. The bread also represented a philosophy of war that differed fundamentally from Japan's. The Japanese military viewed suffering as noble, even necessary. Soldiers were praised for marching on empty stomachs, for subsisting on starvation rations. But the Americans believed that soldiers fought best when cared for. They invested in food, medicine, rest, and morale. Fresh bread symbolized this approach perfectly. It was not strictly necessary, but it made men stronger, happier, more resilient. And in modern war, those qualities translated into endurance, cohesion, and victory. For the Germans too, the bread was a shock, but for the Japanese it was almost incomprehensible. On remote Pacific islands, Japanese soldiers starved, sometimes reduced to eating roots, insects, or even leather. Supply convoys were sunk, local resources exhausted, and men wasted away. Meanwhile, American soldiers dug into loaves baked only days earlier, often still warm. It was a contrast so extreme that it forced Japanese commanders to confront the truth. They were not simply fighting soldiers. They were fighting a system that could make the impossible routine. The symbolism of bread carried deep cultural weight as well. In the West, bread was not just food but identity, the staff of life. To provide bread was to affirm civilization, order, and care. For Japanese officers steeped in their own traditions, it was disorienting to see bread used not as a luxury, but as a staple of war. It was proof that America fought not only with weapons but with culture, bringing its way of life even into the mud of the battlefield. In interrogations after the war, some Japanese officers admitted their disbelief. One recounted seeing American soldiers at Guadalcanal casually eating sandwiches while preparing for patrols. "We thought it was impossible," he said, "but they had ovens behind the lines, trucks that carried flour, and ships that brought more from across the ocean. We could not even bring enough rice." Another admitted that bread revealed more about America's power than any battleship. "A battleship shows strength for one day," he reflected. "Bread shows strength for years." For the Americans, fresh bread was not a boast, but a baseline. They took it for granted, rarely stopping to consider the impression it made on their enemies. Yet for the Japanese commanders who observed it, the message was devastating. America's strength was total, extending even into the smallest details of daily life. Where Japan demanded sacrifice, America provided abundance. Where Japan glorified hunger, America eliminated it. Bread, simple and ordinary, became proof that the war's outcome was inevitable. For Japanese commanders, the bread was not simply food. It was a window into America's larger philosophy of war. To them, rice had long been both sustenance and symbol, tied to centuries of tradition. Japanese soldiers marched with small bags of rice, sometimes mixed with barley or millet, and made do with pickled plums or dried fish if available. In the Pacific campaigns, when supply lines broke down, they were reduced to eating coconuts, roots, or whatever the jungle offered. The Japanese army taught its men to endure hunger as a test of loyalty, to accept deprivation as a mark of honor. Hunger was supposed to forge spirit, but as they observed their American counterparts eating sandwiches and loaves baked behind the lines, they realized that the U.S. military had chosen a completely different path. The American belief was simple but powerful. A soldier who is fed well fights well. Food was not only about calories but about morale. A hot loaf of bread, soft on the inside and still smelling of the oven, reminded a soldier of home, of family, of life beyond the battlefield. It told him that his nation cared for him, that his needs were a priority, that he was more than expendable flesh for the front. Japanese commanders understood that this subtle but constant psychological boost gave American troops an endurance that their own starving soldiers could not match. Mobile bakeries became legendary in the eyes of German and Japanese observers alike. Mounted on trucks or set up in tents, they could follow advancing armies across Europe and the Pacific. Each unit could turn out thousands of loaves a day, ensuring a steady supply for men at the front. Ships carried flour in bulk, and field kitchens mixed dough and baked bread wherever troops were stationed. To the Japanese, who struggled to even transport rice reliably across seas dominated by Allied submarines, the sheer efficiency of this system was overwhelming. Bread was proof that America's logistical reach stretched everywhere. The symbolism cut deep during battles on Pacific islands. Japanese soldiers, cut off and starving, often resorted to eating grass or stripping bark from trees. Diseases like beriberi spread from malnutrition. In contrast, Americans dug trenches, set up field kitchens, and served meals that included fresh bread. Captured Japanese diaries reveal the bitterness and disbelief. How could their enemy eat so well in the middle of nowhere? To officers, the answer was chillingly clear. The Americans were not simply lucky. They had built a system that made abundance possible anywhere, even on coral atolls thousands of miles from home. The bread also revealed something about value. Japanese soldiers were taught that suffering was noble, that deprivation proved purity of spirit. They marched on empty stomachs and believed it made them stronger. Yet here they saw American soldiers who fought with full bellies, and they fought longer, harder, and with more confidence. The conclusion was unavoidable. Hunger did not create strength. It created weakness. Feeding men well created resilience. For commanders steeped in the tradition of sacrifice, This was a bitter revelation. Some Japanese officers later confessed that seeing American bread shook their confidence more than seeing American tanks. Tanks could be destroyed, planes could be shot down. But bread meant something different. It meant that the enemy had solved the hardest problem of war, not how to kill, but how to sustain. One officer described watching captured American rations laid out in camp. Bread, canned meat, coffee, chocolate. It was not rations, he said bitterly. It was luxury, and yet it was for their common soldier. He realized then that Japan had sent its men to war armed with courage, but starved of everything else. The impact of bread stretched into the hearts of Japanese troops themselves. Captured soldiers often spoke of the humiliation of being fed American rations after surrender. They expected punishment or starvation, but instead they were given loaves, sandwiches, and hot meals. For men who had not seen bread in months, sometimes years, it was disorienting. It confirmed what their commanders already feared, that America was fighting a different kind of war, one in which abundance itself was a weapon. Bread was not only nourishment but symbolism, carrying messages of superiority that were impossible to ignore. A Japanese commander at Saipan admitted later that when he saw American soldiers eating, captured diaries from Japanese soldiers revealed bitterness and resignation. "We eat less each day," one soldier wrote, "but the Americans eat as if they were at home. They have ovens in the jungle. We have empty stomachs." Such confessions highlighted the deep divide, not only in resources but in philosophy. America believed in sustaining its men. Japan demanded they endure deprivation. One system produced strength, the other exhaustion. But bread also exposed a fatal flaw in Japan's strategic planning. Leaders had believed that quick victories would force America to negotiate. They had not prepared for a long war of attrition. Bread proved that America could fight for years without running out of supplies. Every loaf baked at the front lines was a reminder that America's industrial heartland remained untouched, feeding its armies across oceans. Japanese commanders whose supply convoys were steadily destroyed by Allied submarines saw in those loaves the inevitability of collapse. Even in the final year of the war, when Japan was reduced to desperation, American soldiers continued to eat bread daily. The consistency was itself a weapon. Japanese officers remarked that nothing seemed to disrupt the enemy's supply system, not storms, not distance, not even fierce resistance. Bread arrived as surely as bullets. It became, in their eyes, proof that America's war effort was unstoppable. To American soldiers, it was just bread. To Japanese commanders, it was a vision of defeat served fresh each morning. It symbolized not only the strength of American logistics, but also the futility of Japan's endurance strategy. They could demand sacrifice from their men, but sacrifice could not bake bread. Only factories, farms, and supply chains could do that. And those belonged to America. For the Japanese High Command, reports of American soldiers eating fresh bread in the midst of combat zones were more than just unsettling anecdotes. They were evidence of a larger truth. The war was no longer a contest of armies alone, but of systems, and America's system was proving unbreakable. The simple loaf of bread carried with it a message as devastating as any bomb or shell, that America could fight comfortably while Japan fought desperately. Field intelligence officers frequently submitted reports detailing the contents of captured U.S. supply depots. Again and again they listed flour, yeast, and portable ovens among the captured equipment. These discoveries baffled Japanese analysts. Why would America dedicate precious shipping space to such luxuries as bread oven? The answer became painfully obvious. Because America had the space, the ships, the factories, and the foresight to ensure that even luxuries became routine. For Japan, which struggled to transport even basic rice rations to its garrisons, the idea was inconceivable. On the ground, the difference was undeniable. American soldiers fought with energy, their bodies sustained by thousands of calories each day. Their rations included not only bread but canned meats, fruits, vegetables, chocolate, and coffee. The Japanese soldiers opposing them often survived on handfuls of rice, sometimes supplemented with foraged plants or insects. Malnutrition wore them down, sapping their strength before battles even began. Commanders noticed the disparity in endurance. American troops could fight longer and recover faster, while Japanese troops weakened over time. The bread in particular became a focus of fascination because it was so symbolic of abundance. It was not hardtack or dried biscuit, but fresh, soft bread, the kind that spoiled quickly and required constant resupply. To provide it regularly meant that America's logistics were not merely functional but excessive, capable of delivering perishable goods across oceans and jungles without interruption. Japanese commanders realized that this was not only a logistical achievement, but also a profound psychological advantage. Soldiers who ate fresh bread felt connected to home, while those who chewed stale rice balls felt abandoned. Japanese diaries from the front revealed growing despair. One soldier wrote, "We are told to fight with spirit, but our stomachs are empty. The Americans eat bread and laugh. How can we endure this?" Such reflections underscored the futility of Japan's strategy. Spirit, no matter how strong, could not replace calorie. Hunger turned discipline into weakness, while bread turned comfort into resilience. The very contrast undermined morale both among the troops and their commanders. The Americans, for their part, rarely considered bread a weapon. For them it was simply part of the daily routine, a reminder of home and a standard expectation of life. Soldiers wrote letters complaining when bread did not arrive on time, not realizing that their complaints reflected a privilege their enemies could never dream of. To Japanese observers, this casual expectation was the most crushing part of all. Bread was treated as ordinary because in America's war machine, abundance was ordinary. The strategic implications of this abundance became clear during long campaigns. On Guadalcanal, Saipan, Leyte, and countless other battlefields, American soldiers marched forward with strength renewed each morning. Their supply chains never faltered long enough to create hunger. Japanese forces, isolated and starved, often entered combat already weak. Commanders reported that soldiers too malnourished to march could not possibly match the stamina of bread-fed Americans. The imbalance turned every encounter into a foregone conclusion. Cultural factors deepened the shock. In Japanese tradition, rice had always been the symbol of sustenance. Soldiers believed that enduring hardship with rice was proof of discipline and loyalty. Yet when confronted with American bread, the comparison was unavoidable. Rice rations, once a source of pride, now looked like desperation. Bread symbolized not only sustenance, but luxury, reminding Japanese commanders that their enemy fought with abundance while they fought with scraps. Some Japanese officers admitted after the war that bread was one of the clearest signs that Japan could never win. One recalled watching American troops landing on a beach and setting up ovens within days. "We fought with rifles and bayonets," he said, "but they fought with factories and ships. The bread told us this more clearly than their gun." Another officer remarked bitterly that America had weaponized comfort, using food to sustain morale as effectively as ammunition sustained firepower. The irony was cruel. Japan's leaders had mocked America as soft, believing that soldiers accustomed to comfort would crumble under hardship. Instead, the opposite proved true. American soldiers did not crumble because they never faced true deprivation. Their comforts gave them strength, while Japanese soldiers, hardened by hunger, eventually broke under the weight of exhaustion. Bread, far from a weakness, had become one of America's greatest weapons. The lesson was not lost on those who survived. For the Japanese commanders who reflected after the war, the memory of bread on the front lines became a symbol of their miscalculation. They had prepared their men to endure suffering, while their enemy had prepared its men to avoid it. And in modern war, avoidance proved stronger than endurance. Bread, soft and perishable, had outlasted steel and spirit. By the final year of the war, Japanese commanders could no longer dismiss reports of American abundance as exaggeration. The evidence was everywhere. Prisoners captured during the island campaign spoke openly about their rations, describing not only canned goods and chocolate, but also the astonishing presence of fresh bread. American propaganda broadcasts reinforced these claims, boasting that U.S. troops were never hungry, even in the harshest conditions. At first, Japanese officers considered this psychological warfare, but captured supplies told the truth. The bread was real, and it was plentiful. The bread symbolized more than sustenance. It embodied America's industrial might. To bake thousands of loaves required flour mills operating around the clock, shipping fleets carrying grain across the Pacific, and mobile bakeries deployed near the front. Every slice was the product of an immense chain that stretched from Midwestern farms to remote Pacific atoll. Japanese officers familiar with their own fractured logistics knew that such a feat required not just resources but flawless coordination. Where Japan's convoys were sunk and its garrison starved, America's supply lines seemed endless. On Okinawa, Japanese defenders watched in disbelief as American camps filled with the smell of baking bread only days after landings. Soldiers in mud-soaked uniforms lined up for meals that included loaves, butter, and coffee. For the Japanese, whose rations had already dwindled to handfuls of rice and boiled weeds, the sight was both humiliating and devastating. Bread became not just food but psychological warfare, proof that the Americans were living better in combat than Japanese troops lived at home. Letters from Japanese soldiers captured on the battlefield often revealed despair over this contrast. "They eat as if they are in their own country," one soldier wrote, "while we eat scrap." Another lamented that hunger had become their true enemy, draining their strength long before American bullets arrived. Commanders recognized that this morale gap was impossible to close. Spirit could not replace food, and bread served fresh at the front provided the Americans with a steady confidence that no amount of ideology could replicate. The bread also influenced the tempo of warfare. American troops, well-fed and energized, could sustain longer campaigns without rest. They advanced quickly, fought aggressively, and recovered faster between battles. Japanese forces, weakened by constant hunger, fought with desperation but lacked endurance. Commanders noticed that battles dragged less for the Americans because their soldiers remained strong. Bread may not have been listed in strategy reports, but its effects were written in every battlefield outcome. Cultural humiliation deepened the sting. In Japan, rice was more than food, it was identity. The empire had always defined itself by its rice fields, by the belief that rice sustained both body and spirit. Yet here they saw an enemy who fought not with rice but with bread, and bread proved the superior fuel for modern war. This realization carried symbolic weight. Japan's traditions, so central to its pride, were no match for America's industrial adaptability. Some Japanese officers even admitted privately that bread was a clearer sign of defeat than American warship. A battleship could be sunk, an airplane shot down, but bread was inexhaustible. It came every day, baked anew, proof that America's capacity never waned. One officer later recalled thinking, "We had rifles, they had loaves." In the end, the loaves won. His bitter words underscored how deeply the symbol of bread cut into Japan's military psyche. The Americans themselves barely noticed the effect. For them, bread was part of the routine, a comfort taken for granted. Soldiers grumbled when rations were late, not realizing that their complaints would sound absurd to enemies surviving on starvation. The casualness of abundance was, perhaps, America's greatest strength. It showed that comfort had become so normal that even at war soldiers expected. Japanese officers realized that such expectations created morale far stronger than any forced discipline. By 1945, as surrender loomed, the memory of bread haunted Japanese commanders. They understood that the war had been lost not just in battles but in kitchens, bakeries and supply depots. America's ability to feed its men fresh bread at the front lines revealed a truth too painful to deny. Japan had entered a war it could never win. Spirit could not replace supply, and sacrifice could not outlast abundance. Bread, soft and fleeting, had proven stronger than ideology. For Japanese commanders, every report of American troops eating fresh bread was a reminder that they were fighting an enemy whose war machine extended far beyond the battlefield. A loaf of bread might seem insignificant compared to tanks or bombers, but in practice, it represented something more terrifying, a nation capable of projecting abundance across ocean. America was not just supplying bullets and shells, it was supplying comfort, morale and a taste of home, and doing so on a scale that Japan could never replicate. The American field bakery system had become a marvel of wartime engineering. Truck-mounted ovens could roll with advancing units, setting up operations within hours of securing ground. Each unit produced thousands of loaves per day, distributed not only to rear camps but directly to frontline mess tents. Soldiers spoke of the comfort of tearing into warm bread, buttering slices, or making sandwiches with canned meat. To the Japanese, this was unimaginable. Their supply lines were shattered by American submarines, leaving garrisons to starve on islands where rice and saltfish were hoarded like treasure. Commanders who studied captured rations realized the scale of America's commitment. Bread was not included as a luxury, but as a daily staple, where the Japanese soldiers' rice ball was symbolic of sacrifice and endurance. The American soldiers' loaf symbolized abundance and assurance. This difference revealed a fundamental gap in philosophy. Japan asked its soldiers to embrace suffering as proof of loyalty. America eliminated suffering to keep its soldiers loyal. That shift in values produced a resilience that shocked Japanese observers. The disparity was clearest during extended campaigns. On Saipan and Iwo Jima, Japanese defenders were already weakened by malnutrition. Before the battles even reached their climax, soldiers collapsed from exhaustion, their energy drained by empty stomachs. American troops, by contrast, fought on with energy sustained by consistent meal. They could dig, march and fight day after day, their morale reinforced by food that reminded them of home. Japanese commanders saw in bread not just calories but morale itself, an invisible weapon that proved as decisive as artillery. Diaries recovered after battles reveal how deeply bread affected Japanese troops psychologically. One soldier wrote of the torment of smelling bread drifting from American camps. "We had not eaten for 2 days," he confessed. "The enemy dines as if in peace. Their laughter is salt in our wounds." Another wrote bitterly, "Their bread is victory. Our hunger is defeat." Such reflections made their way back to commanders, who recognized that morale was collapsing not only from defeat in battle, but from the humiliating contrast of daily sustenance. The symbolism of bread as civilization struck especially hard. To the Americans, serving bread at the front lines was proof that war had not stripped away order or comfort. To the Japanese, whose soldiers often ate weeds or leather to survive, it was proof that their nation had failed to protect them. Commanders could not ignore the irony. Their soldiers starved on islands supposedly defended with honor, while their enemies brought civilization in the form of bakeries. One officer captured late in the war admitted that bread was the clearest sign of defeat he had ever witnessed. "We thought America soft," he recalled, "but soft bread was stronger than hard rice. They fought with comfort and it gave them strength. We fought with sacrifice, and it gave us only death." His words reflected a dawning realization. The war was not a clash of equals, but a demonstration of imbalance, and bread was the simplest yet most devastating symbol of that imbalance. For American troops, bread was rarely thought of as a weapon. They grumbled if it was stale, joked about it when it was rationed, and only occasionally noted how much it meant to have it at the end of a long march. But for the Japanese commanders who observed from the other side, it was proof that America's supply chains could accomplish the impossible. Bread did not last long without spoiling, yet somehow the Americans always had it. To replicate that required a level of industrial production, logistical planning, and transportation power that Japan simply did not possess. By 1945, as Japan's cities burned and its army starved, the memory of bread on the front lines lingered as a bitter humiliation. Officers who had once boasted of spirit and endurance now admitted that those ideals could not overcome hunger. Bread had revealed the truth. America's strength was not only in its weapons, but in its ability to sustain war with abundance. Every loaf that reached a foxhole was a message, clear and undeniable. This was a war Japan could never win. By the closing months of the war, the image of American soldiers eating bread had become almost mythic among Japanese commanders. To them it represented everything their nation lacked, and everything their enemy seemed to possess in infinite supply. Bread was not a weapon in the conventional sense, but it had become one of the most powerful symbols of American superiority, a daily reminder that Japan was fighting against a machine that never ran out of energy, comfort, or morale. The Japanese officer corps was no stranger to hardship. They had long prided themselves on endurance, on their ability to march for miles with little food, to sleep in mud, to fight through exhaustion. But they began to recognize that endurance was not enough when the enemy's soldiers did not face those hardships in the first place. Bread eliminated hunger before it could sap morale. It kept American troops sharp and steady, while Japanese soldiers grew gaunt, weary, and resigned. On islands like Peleliu and Okinawa,
The contrast became unbearable. Japanese troops held out in caves, starving and diseased, surviving on dwindling supplies of rice mixed with roots or insects. They grew weaker with each passing week, their commanders reduced to urging them on with appeals to spirit and sacrifice. Across the battlefield, Americans built kitchens, ovens and bakeries, feeding their soldiers with loaves, butter and even jam. For the Japanese it was an incomprehensible luxury. For the Americans it was standard procedure. The psychological divide widened with every campaign. American soldiers fought with the assurance that food would always arrive. Supply ships followed them, trucks carried flour, and bakeries baked without interruption. Japanese soldiers, by contrast, never knew when or if their next meal would come. They fought with desperation, not assurance, and desperation eventually gave way to despair. Japanese commanders realized that this morale gap was unbridgeable. No speech, no ideology, no threat could make a starving man fight with the same energy as one who had eaten his fill. Captured Japanese documents reveal the bitterness commanders felt. One officer wrote, "We starve, they feast. They fight with full stomachs, we fight with empty ones. Spirit cannot close the gap." Another admitted that the smell of bread drifting across battlefields broke morale more effectively than artillery. It was proof they lived in another world, he reflected. We were fighting ghosts of abundance. Such confessions underscored how deeply bread had become a psychological weapon, one America wielded without even realizing it. The symbolism extended beyond the battlefield. Bread represented civilization, stability, and the ability to project normal life into abnormal conditions. To Japanese commanders, this was perhaps the most humiliating aspect of all. Their own soldiers lived like animals, gnawing roots and drinking muddy water, while the enemy maintained a semblance of home. It was not just strength, it was defiance of the very conditions of war. Bread meant that America had refused to surrender comfort, even in chaos, and in that refusal lay immense power. Some Japanese officers reflected after the war that bread was more than food, it was propaganda in action. Soldiers who ate bread wrote letters home describing abundance. Prisoners who tasted American bread after capture told their comrades of it. The message spread, America's soldiers were never hungry. That perception alone carried weight, demoralizing those who fought on starvation ration. Even when exaggerated, it conveyed the truth that America's logistical machine had made the impossible routine. American soldiers themselves rarely understood the impact. They joked about stale bread, traded sandwiches, or complained when shipments were late. To them, bread was ordinary, a right as much as a ration. Yet that ordinariness was precisely what crushed Japanese morale. Bread was not treated as a miracle, it was treated as expected. And when abundance becomes expectation, it signals a level of national strength beyond comprehension.
By 1945, the contrast had become unbearable for Japan's commanders. They watched their soldiers grow thinner, their rice stocks vanish, their supply convoys sink beneath Allied torpedoes. Meanwhile, American soldiers tore into loaves, baked only days earlier, their confidence fed with every bite. Bread was the quiet soundtrack of American victory, a daily ritual that said more about inevitability than any battlefield speech. The lesson was clear. Japan had built its war effort on sacrifice, believing that spirit could outlast material disadvantage. America had built its war effort on abundance, believing that strength came from caring for its soldiers as much as arming them. In the end, abundance won. Bread, soft and fleeting, proved harder than the steel of bayonets, and stronger than the slogans of sacrifice. In the aftermath of every major battle, Japanese commanders conducted reviews, piecing together reports from surviving soldiers and intelligence officers. Again and again, the same baffling detail appeared. American troops had fresh bread. It was a constant appearing at Guadalcanal, Saipan, Leyte and Iwo Jima. It became so consistent that some officers began to see it as the clearest measure of the imbalance between the two nations. Where Japan could not even guarantee a handful of rice to its men, America provided loaves daily, as though war itself could not interrupt its routines. The impact of bread on American morale was undeniable. Soldiers who expected bread at meals did not feel deprived, did not lose faith in their supply lines, and did not doubt that their nation valued them. Japanese commanders noticed this with unease. They had built their military around sacrifice, convinced that loyalty was proven through suffering. Yet here was an enemy whose loyalty was reinforced by comfort, and it worked. Soldiers with full stomachs fought with determination, while soldiers with empty ones grew desperate and fatalistic. Field reports showed the contrast clearly. Japanese garrisons, cut off from resupply, shrank into shadows of themselves, their men weakened by disease and hunger. Their American counterparts gained weight, regained energy quickly after wounds, and fought longer without collapse. Bread was not the only factor, but it was the most visible and symbolic. It represented a philosophy of war that prioritized strength through care, rather than strength through suffering. One officer interrogated after the war confessed that bread shook his faith more than any weapon. Tanks can be destroyed, planes can be shot down, he explained, but bread cannot be stopped. It comes every day, new, endless, and it tells the soldier that his country is stronger than the enemy's spirit. To him, bread represented not just calories but inevitability, proof that the United States could sustain its soldiers forever, while Japan's men wasted away. The despair this caused among Japanese troops cannot be overstated. Soldiers wrote in diaries of the torment of hunger, of digging for roots, of watching comrades collapse from exhaustion. Against this backdrop, hearing that their enemy had bakeries at the front lines was devastating. Some spoke of smelling the bread carried on the wind, a cruel reminder that the enemy was living well while they were dying. Commanders realized that morale was collapsing not because of fear of death, but because of the humiliation of hunger in the face of the enemy's abundance. Bread also exposed Japan's industrial weakness in ways weapons did not. A rifle could be manufactured in a workshop, and a plane could be assembled in a factory. But bread required a chain, farmers to grow wheat, mills to grind flour, ships to transport it, and ovens to bake it close to the front. Each step demanded efficiency and abundance. America had mastered that chain. Japan had. The inability to replicate such a system revealed a weakness that no amount of bravery could conceal. The cultural symbolism deepened the wound. For the Japanese, rice was sacred, the essence of life and identity. To see their enemy fight with bread, and to see bread prove superior as a wartime staple was humiliating. It was not only defeat in logistics, but defeat in tradition. Bread was foreign, Western, modern, and industrial, everything Japan had tried to challenge but could not surpass. The loaf became an emblem of the future, while rice represented a past that could not win modern wars. American soldiers rarely realized the power of this symbolism. For them, bread was normal. They complained when it was late, traded it for cigarettes, or joked about its stolen. Yet to the enemy, it was a haunting image of America's might. The ordinariness of bread was the most devastating message of all. Abundance was so natural for the Americans that they barely noticed it. To Japanese commanders, that casualness was proof that their nation was hopelessly outmatched. By the war's final year, many Japanese officers understood that their strategies had failed not just on the battlefield but in the kitchens. Their soldiers had been sent to fight on starvation rations, while their enemies fought on full stomach. Sacrifice had been elevated as a virtue, but hunger had become their downfall. Bread, simple and perishable, revealed that modern war belonged not to those who could endure the most suffering, but to those who could prevent it. As surrender loomed in 1945, Japanese commanders looked back on the war with grim clarity. They could account for lost ships, fallen soldiers, and bombed cities. But what haunted them most were the smaller, quieter symbols of defeat. Among these, none was more potent than the bread eaten daily by American soldiers. It was a reminder that victory had been decided not just by firepower, but by the ability to feed and sustain men across oceans and jungles. The lesson was reinforced in every theater. On Iwo Jima, Japanese defenders starved in caves, surviving on scraps of rice, while American soldiers marched forward with steady meals. On Okinawa, Japanese civilians watched American field kitchens churn out bread, amazed that food could be produced so efficiently in the midst of chaos. Bread was no longer simply food. It was proof that America's war machine was inexhaustible. For Japanese commanders, it became a symbol of inevitability. The war could only end one way. Captured officers later described the humiliation of realizing that their soldiers had fought under conditions designed to break them. They had been asked to endure hunger as a test of loyalty, while their enemies had been spared such suffering. Bread turned the comparison into a daily indictment. "We demanded sacrifice," one officer admitted, "but they gave comfort. In the end, comfort won." His words encapsulated the collapse of an ideology built on endurance, when faced with an enemy who eliminated deprivation entirely. The presence of bread also shaped the way Japanese commanders understood American values. They had expected cruelty, believing the United States to be a nation of decadence and weakness. Instead, they saw soldiers cared for with efficiency and generosity. Bread was not a luxury for officers alone, but a standard ration for every soldier. This equality of sustenance shocked Japanese leaders, who were used to rigid hierarchies where common soldiers often went hungry while officers ate better. Bread distributed to all symbolized a democratic strength Japan could neither understand nor match. Morale, too, was profoundly affected. American soldiers fought with the assurance that their needs would be met. They did not fear starvation, nor did they doubt their nation's commitment to them. Japanese commanders noticed that this confidence translated into endurance. Their own men, starved and weary, could not match the energy of opponents who ate well and often. Bread thus became more than calories. It became the foundation of trust between soldier and nation. The bitterness of this realization lingered. Diaries of captured officers reveal reflections on bread as a weapon more powerful than bombs. "A bomb destroys once," one wrote, "but bread destroys every day, by reminding us we cannot match them." Bread was a daily declaration of superiority, a quiet yet devastating reminder that America had mastered the art of sustaining war as much as fighting it. For the Americans, this truth was invisible. They expected bread, grumbled when it was missing, and rarely thought of it as extraordinary. Yet this ordinariness was the most powerful weapon of all. Abundance was so normal that it went unnoticed, while for the Japanese it was a miracle they could never achieve. Bread, taken for granted, became the clearest signal of America's overwhelming advantage. As Japan surrendered and its commanders faced the ruins of their empire, many reflected bitterly that their nation had waged war with the wrong philosophy. They had believed that hunger forged spirit, that deprivation created discipline. But hunger had weakened their soldiers, and deprivation had destroyed morale. Bread had shown them the opposite truth. Real strength came not from suffering, but from eliminating it. America had understood this, and it had made all the difference. In the final analysis, bread was not a footnote, but a central symbol of the war's outcome. It revealed the scale of America's industry, the reach of its logistics, and the values of a society that cared for every soldier. For Japanese commanders, the memory of bread at the front lines remained long after the war ended, a haunting reminder that their defeat had been written not only in battles, but in bakeries. Bread was simple, soft and fleeting, yet it carried the weight of inevitability. When the war finally ended in August 1945, Japanese commanders carried with them not only the memory of lost battles and destroyed cities, but also the haunting image of American soldiers eating fresh bread at the front lines. To them, bread had become more than a ration. It was a verdict. Every loaf was proof of a nation whose resources and organization were so vast that even in the chaos of battle, comfort could be delivered daily. Bread symbolized everything Japan could not achieve, and in that symbol lay the quiet certainty of defeat. For Japanese officers reflecting in the aftermath, the contrast was painfully clear. Their soldiers had starved in jungles and caves, reduced to chewing roots, grass or leather to survive. Malnutrition bred disease, exhaustion and despair. Hunger became the true enemy, one their nation had no answer for. Meanwhile, America's soldiers, far from home, received loaves baked in field ovens, paired with butter, jam or canned meat. They were not asked to prove loyalty through suffering, but were strengthened through care. The realization was brutal. America fought war not through deprivation, but through abundance, and abundance had triumphed. Bread revealed the larger truth about modern war. It was not only a contest of courage or ideology,
but of system. To bake bread at the front required farms, mills, factories, ships, trucks and portable ovens, an entire chain of production and distribution operating flawlessly across thousands of miles. Japan could not replicate such complexity. Its soldiers were told that spirit would fill the gap, that hunger was noble, that sacrifice would overcome scarcity, but in the end spirit could not replace calories, and sacrifice could not substitute for supply. What struck many Japanese officers most was how ordinary bread seemed to Americans. Soldiers expected it, complained when it was late, and barely considered it remarkable. But casual relationship with abundance revealed a chasm between the two nations. For the Americans, bread was daily life. For the Japanese, it was an unattainable dream. The ordinariness of American abundance was, in itself, the most powerful demonstration of strength. This quiet strength carried deep psychological weight. Soldiers who ate bread felt connected to home, reassured that their nation cared for them. Japanese commanders realized that such reassurance created morale, far stronger than any forced obedience. Their own men, told to embrace hunger as proof of loyalty, grew bitter and weary. Bread gave the Americans not just calories but confidence, while hunger drained Japan's soldiers of both strength and hope. In post-war interrogations, Japanese officers often cited bread as one of the most shocking discoveries of the conflict. One confessed that the smell of baking loaves drifting across battlefields on Saipan convinced him the war was unwinnable. Another admitted that bread represented more than food. It was proof they could live well anywhere, even in war. These testimonies revealed that bread was not a minor detail but a decisive symbol, shaping perceptions as strongly as any battlefield loss. The irony was cruel. Before the war, Japan's leaders had mocked America as soft, decadent, and incapable of enduring. They believed their soldiers' willingness to suffer gave them an edge, but it was precisely America's refusal to accept suffering that gave it the advantage. Bread represented that philosophy in its simplest form. Where Japan demanded sacrifice, America provided abundance. And when the two collided, abundance proved stronger than sacrifice. The memory of bread lingered long after surrender. Former commanders, reflecting years later, still spoke of the humiliation of seeing their enemy eat loaves in foxholes while their own men starved. For them, bread became shorthand for the imbalance of the war, a symbol of a nation that had prepared for every need, while their own had gambled everything on spirit alone. In memoirs and testimonies, bread appeared again and again as the quiet emblem of America's overwhelming power. In the end, victory was written not only in bombs and bullets, but in bakeries and loaves. Bread sustained America's soldiers, bolstered their morale and reminded them of home. It revealed the scale of a logistical machine Japan could never hope to match, and it taught Japanese commanders the most painful lesson of all. Modern war belonged to nations that could provide abundance, not just demand sacrifice. Thus, when Japanese commanders remembered the war, the image that haunted them most was not only the roar of American bombers or the fire of naval guns, but the sight and smell of bread. Ordinary, simple, soft bread, eaten casually at the front lines, had carried a message louder than any weapon. It said that America could fight forever, that scarcity would never touch its soldiers, and that the outcome of the war had been decided long before the first battle was fought.